Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. It's a pleasure to be with you today to start another mini series on the channel on forgotten fathers, the characters of the second century who are so often forgotten about for one reason or another in the early church. And we're kicking off with Apelles, a figure who I feel doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. So today I'm going to take you through his life, or at least what we know of it, and the beliefs of the Apellian followers, as they would be called. So, unfortunately, one of the difficulties of many of the characters that we'll be looking at is that there are very little extant witnesses of their work. And indeed, there are very few external witnesses to the people themselves. Many of the sources that we have for these figures come from much later. And so, before we dive into uh, what we do know about Apelles, it's important to recognize where our information comes from and the sources that are behind it. All that we have of Apelles is from secondary sources, unfortunately. Nothing that he wrote himself still exists today in its totality, and no contemporary of Apelles wrote about him. And so, thus, we have to be very careful in our treatment of the sources to make sure that when they say certain things, that they are genuine. Indeed, it's not just the case that it's a secondary source, but it's secondary sources who also consider Apelles as a heretic. Again, that brings with it certain concerns for us in scholarship to judge the trustworthiness of what's being said. So let me give you a rundown of all of the sources we have, or at least most of the main sources we have for Apelles, so you can get a flavour of where some of the things that I'm going to be saying today come from. Perhaps the most important source and the closest source to Apelles himself is Tertullian, who writes in at least two works on the prescription of heretics and on the flesh of Christ about Apelles. Apelles isn't the focus of these books necessarily at all. He only appears in passing, but nonetheless, we do have some quite revealing material about him from Tertullian, who doesn't view him in the best light. So too, we have Pseudo Tertullian in his Against All the Heresies. Similarly, as someone who is now becoming sort of a proto-Catholic, living in a proto-Catholic world, his view of Apelles is also slightly dim. The next figure is Hippolytus in Refutation of All Heresies, and big shout out to Dr. David Litwa, who did a translation of this text, which is very good and one that I've used a lot in my own work, both for this presentation and also in my PhD thesis. We also have Origen, who is that famous theologian from Alexandria. And in Against Celsus, again, we find notes about Apelles, his life and his work. Epiphanius, the great heresiologist in Panarion, as he's documenting all of the heretics that went before him, he can't help but mention Apelles. And then, even further away from the man himself, we have Jerome. And in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, we get a few snippets. But two things, as I mentioned at the beginning, should be immediately striking about the sources we have. Number one, they are a long time after the figure that we're interested in, and they all come from a different branch or stream of Christianity, if we may call it Apelles' religion, Christianity. And so, therefore, they treat him with a certain degree of suspicion. Again, it only stands to reason, we see it in our daily lives, that if a left wing newspaper is judging a right wing politician, they will always give a negative slant, and vice versa. That's the way that we perceive things in the world. Our biases are always present, and that is no different, maybe even more so, for the early church fathers. So, with our sources out of the way, and that being said, what do we know about Apelles? Just to mention as well, um, one of the things though, although I've mentioned that we can expect biases, right? Um, the other things that we also have to account for because the sources are so far away from the time itself is that we have to account for mistakes in their work. Naturally, they didn't know Apelles, and they only get second, third, fourth, maybe fifth hand accounts of what he did and where he was. And so they are bound to get some of the things wrong. And indeed, we have contradictory um, statements about Apelles. So again, we have to discern as scholars which one might be true. We may also say, though, that just because someone is not in favour or sounds like they would be in opposition to Apelles, it doesn't mean that everything they say will be a lie. And indeed, if it sounds like a believable statement, it probably is. But on the flip side of that, if it sounds like unnecessary slander, like they're just criticizing, with ad hominem arguments, then again, it probably is slander. So there again, three other caveats that I should really make clear. So now we have all of those caveats and sources out of the way. Let's have a look at what we know about Apelles. And we start with his life, of which we know very little, unfortunately. There are very few biographical elements of Apelles, but what we do know is that he was once trained by his instructor and molder, which I think is an interesting word from Tertullian, who was Marcion, the great uh, second century, later known heretic, who produced the first New Testament, which we'll come on to later, of whom I am extremely interested. However, I feel greatly that Marcion probably doesn't fall into the same category as some of the characters we're going to study in this mini-series, as he gets quite a bit of attention. Again, probably not as much as he deserves, but nonetheless, he's probably more well known than Apelles. But Apelles studies under Marcion. We don't know how long he was there for, we don't know how he got there. But one of the interesting things about this is that we can assess some of Apelles's views based on his background. And we're going to come on to later places where, um, after a little while in ministry, he differs from Marcion, and some places where he continues in the Marcionite school of thought. The reason why I say after a little while is because we know that he forsook Marcion. He had a schism from him, and he resorted to the company of a woman. Again, rather cryptic words for he met a lovely woman and copped off with her. And it says that he withdrew to Alexandria out of sight of his master. This is interesting because we don't actually have precise information of why they split. Now, Tertullian says it's because he left with the company of a woman, but scholars often now think that it was probably because of doctrinal differences rather than just an overactive sex drive. I would say that I think that it could also be both. I don't necessarily see an or here. I think an and is also an extremely likely possibility. But nonetheless, him and his great master parted ways, and Apelles goes into the wilderness, well, into Alexandria, but at least out of public life with Marcion. And it says that um, it's confirmed that he went off with a woman in another source. But he returned after some years. And I love the bias here. This is where you get the real underlying catty, snaky, snidey, shady comments from the heresiologists. They say, returning after some years, unimproved, right? It doesn't matter how much he split from Marcion. It doesn't matter what he might have learned, the research he might have gone through, all of these sorts of things. He's unimproved. Well, except for the fact that he was no longer a Marcionite. I mean, okay, you're still really bad, but you're not quite as bad as Marcion. And by this point, he had another woman. So the woman that he left with to go to Alexandria, or that caused some of the issue with Marcion, is now gone, and Apelles is now on to his second, who knows, maybe third. And she's named, and she becomes an important figure in Apelles' life, the maiden Philomena, who herself afterwards became an enormous prostitute. Now, again, let's take this with a pinch of salt. There seems to be some slanderous behavior going on here. Um, Even to use the word enormous prostitute, I don't know how you can add a qualification to the nature of prostitute. Either one is or one isn't. And I think that this perhaps is an undermining of her. And we'll see why it's important to undermine her as well as Apelles in a moment. Um, but at best, she may have become a prostitute, but I think more likely um, she didn't. And this is just nonsense. But the reason why it's important to slander her as well is that Philomena had revelations. She was known as a prophetess. And Apelles documented these revelations or manifestations, sometimes is another translation, and wrote a book all about them. This book is no longer with us today and isn't passed down, so the contents of which is difficult to say. But this certainly would have caused commotion in early proto-Catholic Orthodox circles to have this woman prophesying with the heretic Apelles already. And indeed, this probably wouldn't have been up Marcion Street either in any sense. But nonetheless, Apelles certainly counted her as a close companion and one that he respected the view of and her manifestations. This is not the only volume that he wrote. We also told that he wrote a series of works called the Syllogisms, in which he sought to prove that whatever Moses had written about God was not true, but was false. Again, this text is no longer extant and makes it very difficult to uh, tell you what was in it. Although, in a moment, we might make some guesses as to what this means. But ultimately, we can see that one of the things that perhaps he kept from Marcion was that separation of Christianity from Judaism. So, what were Apelles' core beliefs? What really made him stand out? Well, we begin with the things that he carried over from Marcion. And one of those things is this idea that there was no earthly birth of Christ. That in the 15th year of Tiberius, as an adult, Jesus descended. This is the beginning also of Marcion's gospel. There's no virgin birth, there's no annunciation, there's no incarnation, there's just Jesus descending out of the heavens into into Capernaum, I believe, and there he is, and thus the story of the gospel begins. This means, because this is where his story starts, that we can assume that he didn't use the four Gospels that we have. In fact, in the commentary on Matthew from Jerome, he hints at Apelles having his own Gospel, and indeed maybe some of the Pauline epistles, but you'll notice a question mark there, of which we'll need to come back to later, as this is not entirely clear. But one thing that is definitely true, again carried over from Marcion, is there are no Jewish scriptures in Apelles' canon, in inverted commas. That he does not recognize the Jewish religion as authoritative, nor the prophets of the Old Testament. That is a complete rejection. And again, that's something that Marcion also believed. But it's interesting because their view of Judaism, as we will see, is actually slightly different. But these are the main things of which he carries over from his old molder and instructor. But in so many ways, he also departs from his teacher. So, in his rejection of Judaism, one of the things that we get very clearly from Marcion is that he believes the Old Testament. Indeed, he accepts it to be true. But Apelles differs slightly. The canon may also differ, and this isn't entirely clear. As I mentioned a moment ago, what Pauline epistles Apelles had, who knows? And the Gospel, Jerome seems to say, is different. Their opinion of the flesh and the world departs also quite substantially, and so does marriage and the opinion of celibacy. So let's dive one by one into these four areas of Apelles' beliefs and see if we can bring him back to life just a little. We start with the rejection of Judaism. Harnack writes concerning Marcion that it's highly remarkable that Marcion acknowledged the Old Testament as a self-contained whole, assumed it had no alterations, interpolations, or such, and did not even regard the book as false. Instead, he believed it to be trustworthy throughout. I also think that that is extremely striking, that Marcion accepted it despite believing its origins were evil. But for Apelles, this is slightly different, and he did not accept it as historically accurate. In fact, he referred to it as fables. We're told by Origin that he treated the writings of the Jews as fables. They were stories. They didn't happen. These things didn't exist. And in his book, you know, he tries to write that everything that Moses said was false. Not that um, not a position of saying he's evil, but just that he's wrong. That none of it happened. It wasn't true. He composed treaties against the law and the prophets, attempts to abolish them as if they had spoken falsehoods. Again, not that all the stuff happened with the God of the Old Testament, but that they were just liars. It was made up, it was fictional. This is different from Marcion. A subtle difference, yes, but nonetheless an important one. It signifies in part a move from the ditheism of Marcion to back to a monotheism of sorts for Apelles. He didn't believe that the demiurge existed. There was just the God of the New Testament. The canon is slightly more complex. We know Marcion's canon. This is helpful. He published the first New Testament, as he called it. And we have the books. He begins with his own work and then has his Evangelion, a gospel, and then Galatians 1 2 Corinthians, Romans 1 2 Thessalonians, Laodiceans, which is ostensibly Ephesians but readdressed, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. No one can deny this. This is fine. But we're not given Apelles' canon so strictly. What we're told is that Apelles had his own gospel, as I mentioned earlier, but it's unclear as to whether he kept Marcion's gospel, maybe adapted it, who knows, or whether he had his own amalgamation. There are elements in his gospel of John, we think, as well. So it's difficult to say what he had, and unfortunately, that may well be lost to time. And Jerome's tantalizing, inviting little one sentence about his own gospel is a bit frustrating. Back somewhere else, it says he selects from the gospels whatever pleases himself. Right? That, an element of, well, he's got all of our gospels, and he's just picked and choosed where he wanted to be. It gets even more upsetting and unclear when we get to the Pauline epistles. We know that Marcion had the Pauline corpus that eventually would become to be accepted minus the pastorals as Pauline. And we only get, again, one little snippet. He says, Apelles uses only one apostle, but that is Marcion's. That is a mutilated one. You see, Roger Parvu tries to bring out that Pseudo-Tertullian is saying that Apelles only uses one Pauline letter. He argues that this statement here, that he only uses one apostle, means that he only uses one Pauline epistle as canonical or views it as authoritative. I think this from Parvu is an overextension and places a burden on the text that isn't necessarily present, actually. And that more likely, Apelles was using the one apostle, that being Paul, but all of his epistles. Now the question is, I think, more importantly, is Did he use just Marcions in the Marcionite form? Well, perhaps, probably, because Pseudo-Tertullian says it was a mutilated one, it was Marcion's, which therefore means he probably used Laodiceans and not Ephesians. And in addition to that, he probably also didn't include the pastorals. I think that's about as much as we can glean from the short text, but even that, I admit, is placing some uh, strain on the text. It's just not clear from Pseudo-Tertullian exactly what was present. All we do know is that whatever Pauline epistles Apelles was using, it was not the canonical version, it was Marcion's. And that's significant even of itself, that Marcion's New Testament was received and attested and used as authoritative. It wasn't just the canonical text in the second century that was circulating in early Christian communities. I think, though, that one of the most striking differences, and again, this plays also back into the considerations of the Old Testament, is the use of the flesh and the world, and the two early Christian fathers, that their view of the flesh and the world. You see, from Marcion, because the Old Testament is true, and the demiurge created this horrible mess, the sphere of the flesh is evil. Period. This is a bad place, bad people, bad things. Ugh, disgusting. But because Apelles rejects the Old Testament, rejects the idea of the demiurge, or a second lesser god of some form, he's not bound to the same hatred in that way. And in fact, for Apelles, we're told that he seems to believe that this world originated in the imitation of a superior world. So this world isn't perfect. It's not uh, it's not sort of the highest world, sort of a Platonic forms going on here. It's not the highest world, but it's not bad. It's just an imitation of it. We might say it's good, or at the very least, it's not evil. And this is in stark contrast to Marcion. Marcion really was against the sphere of the flesh, bringing out some of those more extreme Pauline verses about the evilness of the world. But this plays an important part in both the anthropology of Apelles, I think, and also in his working out of salvation, and both his practical, ethical elements of the religion, and also his own personal life and the way that he views others and his own morality. I emphasize this point because one's view of the flesh and the world directly impacts the marriage and the celibacy issue that clearly comes between Marcion at some point and Apelles. You see, I think one of the things that is indicative of Apelles's theology is this flesh and world stuff, which stems back to the treatment of the Jews. These these three things are inextricably linked. Because Apelles doesn't believe the Old Testament existed, or didn't happen, sorry, it was historically inaccurate, he can therefore reject the demiurge, which means he can therefore accept that the world and the flesh are not completely evil, which means he can therefore accept that marriage is good and we don't have to be all ascetic celibates living in caves, whipping ourselves and sleeping on beds of nails. That's why these are the four things that I've drawn out from Apelles. And all four of them lead to, I believe, the split from Marcion. It was doctrinal and theological, but it leads, those doctrinal and theological differences lead to moral differences, ethical differences. And that's the last one here, is it's marriage and celibacy. Tertullian suggests that Apelles, along with Marcion and Valentinus, prohibited marriage. And this is one of the contradictory points of the witnesses of Apelles. And I think that this uh, is actually incorrect, or at least was written for a different part of Apelles' life. I think that Tertullian's either describing here what Apelles was like while he was with Marcion and in that crowd, or he actually has got it wrong. I'm more inclined to agree with the first rather than the second, and that's because later on Tertullian tells a different story about leaving with a woman, i.e., surely Apelles' view must have changed by this point. Again, as I just mentioned. It's also true that Apelles, apart from going off with at least two women, does not appear to be an ascetic. There's nothing of him that shows great rigor. Nothing that screams out to me that he's like those Monty Python sketches where they're whipping themselves walking through the streets in medieval England. In fact, quite the opposite. Often, he seems quite easygoing. He doesn't reject the flesh like Marcion, which means he doesn't have to reject pleasure or nice things. And that's an important difference when it comes to living a life day to day. Apologies for the duplication there. We're told through Eusebius that he had a conversation with a gentleman called Rhodo in about 180. And Rhodo says this. He says, the old man Apelles asserted that those who trusted in the crucified would be saved, if only they were found doing good works. Isn't that interesting? That there, there's just this element of trust. There's almost a foregoing of the moral element here, a foregoing of the necessity to practice in a certain way. I think that's so significant. I can't think of uh, the proto Catholics, you know, or even Catholics today letting that go. It actually sounds quite like modern Protestantism in some sense. Just trust and they'll be saved. Although I suppose there are the good works element. Maybe that wouldn't go down too well. So ultimately, we're dealing with a guy who is different from Marcion in many ways and has his own following. And he is largely unknown to those who are hobbyists in our field or even academics who do know about him. I don't think give him the coverage that he necessarily deserves. So why cover him? Well, this is the very line that stood out to me in Tertullian. The thing that made me realize that he couldn't be overlooked. Tertullian regards Apelles as the third most prominent and influential heretic after Marcion and Valentinus. That's no small comment, right? If he had half of the influence of Marcion and Valentinus, that is huge. That's so significant. And therefore, although I appreciate that it's difficult to comment on the breadth and depth of the influence he did have due to the lack of contemporary commentaries, and the fact that we don't have any material by him to pin down exactly what he believed, I do think that Tertullian's comment can't be ignored. And actually, as I say, even by the 180s, he clearly had influence and a following. And he was so influential that even after 200 years, 250 by the time of Jerome, commentators were still looking at his work, criticizing it, along with Marcion and Valentinus, who most people know because they are the prominent figures. He must have had an impact. His life, work, and theology should be studied more widely, and his place in second century Christianity recognized, even despite the caveats that I've just described. And so thus, this is the first figure, hopefully in a long list that we're going to cover here on the channel, looking at these forgotten fathers. If you have any questions about Apelles, please drop them down in the comments and I'll try and answer them. Again, like I say, we don't know all that much about him, so the chances are I don't know because nobody knows. But please like the video, subscribe, and let me know who you'd like to see me comment upon more in the future of either the Forgotten Colleague series or the Forgotten Father series. Thank you so much.